Hey everybody, so this is my first workout back after doing the month of Matt Fury style combat conditioning training. Honestly, I'm glad to be back doing a little bit of weight training and having a little bit more variety than just doing that repetitive calisthenics all the time. Although I do think that was an interesting experiment and it did teach me a lot about how much of my training needed to be body weight to get everything that I wanted out of it. Anyways, this here, what I'm showing is a much more accurate snapshot of my general training, where my generalist training, I guess is a way to put it, because I am just focusing on improving a lot of different attributes at once and trying to maximize carryover without completely exhausting myself. It's a bit of a balancing act, and as always, the ultimate factor becomes managing fatigue and recovery resources. The basis for this cycle of programming comes from actually from an old strongman style workout that I used to do, based on the mass building program of a strongman coach here on YouTube called Brian Alsrew. The original program is based around, mostly barbell training. Essentially, I guess you could call it power building. I don't know if that term is still in vogue or not, but that's basically what it was called at the time. Unfortunately, I ran into the problem that most power building style training runs into, which is that you're trying to have a high intensity and a high volume at the same time. And so the intensity and the volume combine to just make an extremely demanding and physically exhausting program. So it was great when I initially used it because I had been living abroad for several months, studying in India, and the diet was very substandard, and I got sick all the time from eating sketchy street food because I didn't have any self control whenever I'd smell delicious street food. As a consequence of that, I was unnaturally thin when I came back. I think I had dropped 25 pounds or so in the course of a few months. And so I basically just went on a rampage trying to regain the weight as quickly as possible and regain the strength and muscle mass that I had lost. And thankfully, due to the programming I was using, I was able to do that in a shocking amount of time. I think I was pretty close to my previous threshold of strength within 2 or 3 months. But again, even back then, when I really had nothing else going on, I was just a student returning home and didn't have a ton of responsibilities and not as many recovery demands and energy demands as I do these days. It was still just absolutely burying me into the ground. I remember the sheer complete exhaustion that I was feeling by the end of the program was just like almost nothing else I'd ever felt. Most people don't know what it's like to just push into true like central nervous system fatigue where you just can't output any more effort, but it's a horrible feeling and I wouldn't recommend it for anybody. It's just awful. It's a different kind of tiredness than your normal like missed night of sleep. Anyways, I kind of had a brain blast a few days ago before coming up with this programming where I realized that if I were to use kettlebells and calisthenics, that I could take advantage of having much lower recovery demands. Even when I'm doing my doubles here, I'm usually lifting about two-thirds of what I'd be lifting with a barbell, roughly. And what that means is as long as I'm not completely overzealous and like weighting the uh, as long as I'm not completely overzealous and loading the weights too heavily, I'll actually be able to recover from the demands of this workout in a reasonable time frame. I'll make sure to post the link to the original video. It's a very interesting one and just kind of a great insight into Brian's programming and just strength programming in general. I think a lot of people fall into what I call the valley of mediocrity when they hit that intermediate level of strength training where they just don't actually know how to progress into a higher level. And a programming like that really shows you what it takes to push yourself into an advanced level of strength and fitness. It's not for everyone. It does require a lot of discipline and a lot of diligence, and there's just going to be certain workouts that are pretty painful and you're going to be very sore after. So I would just only recommend doing it if you really have the commitment to, uh, fully go in on it. Anyways, the basic structure is three giant sets, which you can see I'm doing here. So there's a strength focus set and an assistance. There's a strength focus set. There's a technique focus set, which is kind of for your accessory movements. And then there's an assistance finisher at the end. And then you have conditioning, which is the very end. And there's a lot of built-in conditioning demands into the original workout as well, because Brian is a big advocate of, anaerobic conditioning for strongman type uh, athletes. And so luckily that integrates extremely well into the kettlebell calisthenics version I'm doing. So while the basic format is still pretty similar, just by using these different implements and modalities, I'm changing a lot of the stimulus. I'm also using a lot of ballistic style movements. I've just become increasingly convinced that the bread and butter of kettlebell training is the ballistics. Obviously, I'm still doing a fair amount of, strength style grind movements, which is like grind is just the term for any non-ballistic kettlebell movement for those who are not aware of the lingo. At least I think that's what they are. There's just a lot of like weird um, tribalism within the kettlebell community. I think it's just marketing gone awry. Anyways, I don't particularly give a damn about what style of training I'm doing. Like, I just do the stuff that works and get the results that I want. The nice thing, though, is that while I do have like a pretty brutal strength component, I'm still getting a lot of this conditioning in. The full thing, I'm probably going to start integrating jump ropes and some other things to keep my heart rate up. But then there is just enough volume and I can fit in targeted exercises like these pullovers that allow me to do some bodybuilding style work. So for a while I was using a lot of barbells and machines to do Vince Duranda's exercises and style of training. And while I really loved that, I was curious to see if I could replicate a lot of it with calisthenics and kettlebells. And I think I'm actually doing a fairly good job. I'm getting a pretty similar stimulus. And so that's very exciting because that means I don't have to go into a crowded gym if I don't want to. And that is a big plus for me. One of the things I like about pullovers while I'm, showing the film of that, they are an excellent lat training movement. They're kind of, depending on your leverage, if you're doing, decline, incline, whatever, they are kind of a hybrid of a row and a pull up. But the main benefit that they have over these two is that you don't have to use your arm flexor. So your arm flexors, so the biceps, essentially the muscles that fail during most back training are not very integral to the pullover, and so that allows you to really focus on the back and the scapula, and you actually get a fair amount of chest stimulus as well, and you also get a great stretch. The muscles of your ribs are trained. It's really, if I were to pick one upper body movement, period, it would be the pullover. Like if I could only do one for the rest of my life, I think pullovers would win easily. Because they don't have that arm limiting factor, you can just also build really a shocking amount of mass with it. The old 20 rep squats program has them as a staple. I remember I would do pullovers with like 125 to 160 pounds, somewhere in there usually, for 20 reps. And it just is probably the reason that I still have a massive back relative to the rest of my body. It's definitely the strongest part of my body, and I think it's entirely because of that. So now we're moving on into the conditioning. Eventually, I'm just going to start doing this with rings, but I was just testing out stuff on the dip bar because I was just really tired at this point. I think you can see in my face that, things are getting tough, but I was really out of breath at this point, just completely gassed. I didn't have much to go into the tank. So this movement is just an L sit to a dip, which I'm just going to integrate onto the rings. It's one of the precursor movements to the tuck shoulder stand, which is my next goal. I've never been able to do any sort of vertical pressing type stuff on the rings, but I am getting a lot more strong and comfortable on this. This was my attempt at doing a rings cradle type thing, and it failed miserably. I couldn't really get my head in the right position. This is just the hamstring curls, so these are just a staple. If you are somebody that doesn't have a hamstring curl set up at home and doesn't like Nordic curls like I do, then the power wheel is your best possible option. It's pretty inexpensive. It's very, very effective. I'm honestly astounded how often people neglect just the knee flexion aspect of hamstring training when it's one of the easiest ways to avoid getting unnecessary injuries. It's also just a great mass builder. Like the nice thing about hamstring curls is really as long as you're getting a bit of a loaded stretch at the bottom, then you're going to be able to build a decent amount of hypertrophy with it. So this is me attempting to integrate primal flow after about a month of not using it. So I definitely have the strength to do it, but the coordination and mobility was quite lacking. Like, I'm super rusty, as you can tell. I'm also just completely exhausted by this point. Like, my arms were really fatigued. You can see how pumped up my triceps are. So they're really clumsy. It's probably some of the worst primal flow stuff I've ever done. It is supposed to obviously be graceful and flowing, and it is just not that at all. So I'm kind of just fumbling around, but it was just my first time back after about a month of it. So I'm just willing to, give it a shot and then know that I'm going to get more comfortable with it over time. And I'm recording this after doing the second workout, and I feel like I've gotten a little more comfortable, and that within a few more workouts, I'll have shaken the rust off. Once I've regained a lot of that fluidity and mobility, I think it will be a pretty good conditioning finisher. I find that Primal Flow really has a very low strength demand if you do other sorts of calisthenics. I don't know what it's like for the average person, but for me, it's basically nothing. And so I could just do it as like a strength endurance, or not even as an endurance thing. I can basically just do it as a cardio thing at the end of workouts. And I think I'll do that from now on. So if you like this style of videos, you have any questions about more generalist training, feel free to, leave a comment. Make sure to like, subscribe, share it with your friends. The whole shebang.